Okay, good afternoon and warmly welcome to our webinar, our integrate webinar on the European Green Deal, what is in it for forests and forestry in the times of Covid and Greta. My name is Georg Winkel. I work for the European Forest Institute in Bonn, and I will be the moderator of this webinar. The main rationale of the webinar is that we would like to have an informed discussion with two top-level policy makers, to put it like that, about the Green Deal and its impact on forests and forestry, with a special focus on integrated forest management. Just a word about integrated forest management. Integrated forest management we see as approaches that integrate the provision of different forest ecosystem services within the same spatial context. So for that webinar, we put some questions to our distinguished speakers that are, for instance, what approach should Europe take to implement on forests in the Green Deal? How to deal with key issues such as climate change, biodiversity, bioeconomy, and societal expectations, and also trade-offs between these issues when it comes to forest management? What is the impact of COVID on the Green Deal in relation to forest? What needs to be done? What is the role of integrated forest management approaches that aim to integrate forest use and conservation specifically, also in European policy? The webinar is hosted as an event of the European Network Integrate. The European Network Integrate is an informal consultation and exchange process initialized by the Czech and the German Ministry of Agriculture 3 or 4 years ago, and also endorsed by the Standing Forestry Committee. It has the mission, or the network should promote and advance forest management approaches for the integration of nature conservation into sustainable forest management. And it should do this at 3 levels: the decision-making level, the level of forest practitioners and managers, and the level of research and academic knowledge. So the basic idea is to connect research, to connect forest management and conservation practice, and to connect policymaking with each other in advancing these approaches. The initiative is driven by country representatives and also their topical interests. Currently, there are 19 European countries participating, and the European Commission is acting as an observer. The chairs has been, so the network operates through meetings that are normally organized at the places where the chairs are located, so in the countries that are chairing the network. Now we have turned, of course, for obvious reasons, to some virtual events like this one. Germany was chairing the starting event 2017, Czech Republic was chairing 2018, we had Poland 2018, 2019 with 2 events, Denmark 2019, 2020, the Danish Nature Agency is the current chair, and then there's Switzerland and Spain as upcoming chairs in 2020 at the end of the year and 2021 onwards. And we as the European Forest Institute, we facilitate the network currently within the Forest Site project funded by the German BML, and we are grateful for their support. The webinar will be scheduled as follows. Following my introduction, we will hear a welcoming words by the current Integrate Network Chair, Mats Jensen, representing the Danish Nature Agency. Then we have our 2 distinguished keynote speakers. First, Humberto Delgado, Rosa, from the European Commission DG Environment. And then from Ireland, the Forest Minister, Andrew Doyle, representing a second perspective. Then we will have a question and answer session. And in about 1.5 hours from now, we will end the webinar. Finally, a few webinar rules. As we have quite many people that were planning or registering to attend the meeting, we will only allow the speakers and the moderators to unmute and to be visible via video, and all other attendants will have to be muted and your videos will be disabled. So you can sit on a couch and watch in a very relaxed mode this webinar. However, we really would like to ask you to ask questions and put comments via the questions and answer function in Zoom. And please also make sure who you are and make sure whom you want to address. We will, while the speakers are presenting, we will categorize the questions and we will put them to the speakers after the presentation. Depending on how many questions you will be asking, of course, we can only select a few questions. So once again, use the question and answer function. Please say who you are and whom you want to address. You can also address both speakers. And again, we will have a question and answer section after the keynote presentation. And please don't be angry with us if you skip your question. We're expecting quite many questions, but we don't know. Also, you should know that the webinar will be recorded and will be available online afterwards. So for instance, if you're facing technical difficulties in following, that is also an option for you to watch the recording of the webinar after the event. And finally, for more information on the Integrate network, please refer to the link below in my presentation. So far from my side, I'm now happy to pass the word over to Mats Jensen from the Danish Nature Agency and the current chair of the Integrate network. Mats, hello to Copenhagen. I'm not sure if you're at the moment in Copenhagen, and the floor is yours.
Thank you, Geo, and thank you for the short introduction to the webinar and the introduction of the Integrate network. As Danish chair of the Integrate network, I'm happy to welcome you all to today's webinar. Due to the corona crisis, we have been forced to postpone network activities. The 6th International Integrate Network meeting was planned to take place in Gribskov, north of Copenhagen in Denmark this spring. This meeting has been postponed to the 28th of September and will be conducted as a webinar. We are sorry not to be able to meet you in the forest and discuss with you. We still think we have many interesting things to show you, and we are looking forward to host you here in Denmark. We're looking forward to host you here in Denmark. The next physical network meeting is expected to take place in Basel, Switzerland on the 9th to 13th of November. Please save these dates and find more information on the network website. We are looking forward to the next physical meeting, a core activity of the network. Despite the corona crisis, it has been important for us to keep the network alive. Thus, we look to initiatives to arrange today's webinar. The subject of today is current interests to the network members. The new EU strategy, a biodiversity strategy, is expected to play an important role for Europe forest and vice versa. We are looking forward to the presentations and following discussions. Before I give the word to Geo on behalf of the network members, I would like to thank Evie Bunn for planning and arranging today's event, and not least thank our keynote speakers, Mr. Andrew Doyle, Irish Minister of State at the Department of Agriculture, Food and Marine, and Mr. Humberto Delgado, Director for National Capital, DG Environment at the European Commission, for your contribution to this relevant and interesting topic. Have a nice meeting, all of you. Please, Geo, the word is yours.
Thank you, Mats. Thank you for your warm and welcoming words. I would suggest that while Humberto is already starting to chair his presentation, I'm introducing you, Humberto. Our first keynote speaker is Humberto Delgado Rosa. He is currently Director for Natural Capital in DG Environment in the European Commission, and as such one of the key person in the Commission involved in the Green Deal and also in his relation to forest and nature in Europe. He was previously Director for Mainstreaming, Adaptation and Low Carbon Technology in DG Climate Action. He has also served as the Secretary of State for the Environment of the Portuguese government in the 2005 to 2011, and before that he was advisor for environmental matters to the Prime Minister of Portugal. So it's very obvious that he is experienced and really experienced in European and international environmental policy issues, particularly relating to biodiversity and climate change. And also, he has a science background. He holds a PhD in evolutionary biology. Humberto, the floor is yours. We are looking forward to your keynote speech.
Thank you very much, Jörg, Mats, and let me first thank everyone, the panelists, the participants, and especially the Integrate Network for this opportunity to share with you some thoughts on our forests linked to the wider Green Deal and specifically to the biodiversity strategy that I aim to present you briefly. So I hope you can see well my slides and listen to me well. I will be starting now. Just to signal the following: the European Green Deal has, of course, many leaves, let's say, but I would say that some leaves are particularly important. And one angle I used to put on it is, of course, climate remains a very fundamental part of it as a main challenge that we all face globally towards sustainability. But a bit of a novelty is that next to climate, there's quite some attention in the Green Deal to biodiversity. Actually, this attention came even before the Green Deal, when the political guidelines of the current president of the European Commission were presented, where, let's say, in a nutshell, I think both global challenges, climate change and biodiversity, are presented there as linked, well underpinned by science, with potentially catastrophic consequences for humankind if unabated, and with offering some opportunities and win-win solutions. Actually, if you read the Green Deal, I think in the very first 4 lines, there's reference to climate change and biodiversity, and actually to forests, so the risks that forests are facing. So with this said, there are some other reasons for one to have in front of us this biodiversity strategy, which I would say is really rather ambitious. And some of those reasons are: first, there's an international context. There's biodiversity loss everywhere in the world, including in Europe. That's very much perceived as a threat for humankind, as I said. Also an economic threat. And if you take attention to the World Economic Forum in its assessment of global risks, biodiversity is climbing up to the very top 3, 4, or 5, I don't remember exactly. And there's a connection between biodiversity loss and other challenges. To begin climate change, they inter-influence each other, and also to other threats as pandemics. We all know that this COVID-19, as other zoonoses before it, have a natural origin and are linked to the way we mismanage nature or we mismanage wildlife. So this sense of biodiversity being important globally and including in the context of recovery has underlined has served as a background for having an ambitious biodiversity strategy. Just one more word on that, which is there were in the past other biodiversity strategies, and indeed there were in the past other deals on nature made globally under the Convention on Biological Diversity. The one up to 2010 aimed to halt biodiversity loss. The second one ending this year aimed to halt biodiversity loss. Well, they didn't. Actually, things got much worse. And we need a new global framework for biodiversity up to 2030, which must be more ambitious. To give you a couple of words on the biodiversity and the pandemics, I referred briefly to that. This link between human health and ecosystem health is more and more evident. It's a one health approach between humans, plants, animals, nature. We also know that the risk of emergence of infectious diseases does increase when nature is destroyed. There are other cases before COVID-19. So in essence, this perception that protecting and restoring biodiversity is one of the components for a more resilient society from several angles, to from extreme weather events to zoonoses, has legitimated that the biodiversity strategy was approved amidst pandemics. In terms of recovery, all our minds are now how to recover from this amazing health and economic impact. Well, it's very clear that biodiversity can and should be linked to the recovery, not because of what I said, which is there's quite an economic case on biodiversity, what it delivers to the human economies through the services it provides to people, but also the opportunities to invest in natural capital usually are cost efficient and deliver multiple benefits. And some of the examples, I'll be returning to this last one, the 3 billion trees. If you imagine this target to have 3 billion trees planted until 2030, one can very evidently imagine the many jobs needed to find the seeds, the seedlings, to plan, to monitor, to plant concretely, to follow up. Now, getting into the biodiversity strategy, don't be afraid. I won't say all that is in those 20+ pages. I will just highlight the main components and make a reference where they link to specifically to forests. But these are the main elements of the biodiversity strategy: a chapter on protection, one on restoration, one on enabling the transformative change, and one on the global context. Under protecting nature, what you can find there is an ambitious goal that is aligned not only with what science says, but also with what the so-called zero draft towards a global deal also suggests, which is going to 30% of EU land and sea protected. This is more demanding on sea than on land, because counting both Natura 2000 plus national areas, we are around some 26% already. But it will be still a challenge integrating ecological corridors, and with another challenge, which is within this 30%, we aim at having 10% which will be strictly protected. And among those, because we do target the biodiversity rich ecosystems, and those are important for the climate, we suggest that primary and old growth forests should be strictly protected, the remaining ones in Europe. And yes, there's some definition and mapping to be done around these concepts. On restoration, again, I won't come to the full set of components of what we call the EU Nature Restoration Plan for 2030, but there are quite some of them that do have a link with forests. First, we will be coming next year with legally binding targets for restoration, still to be set because there's a full impact assessment to be done, but for sure there's here a link with forest restoration. We also aim to bring the protected species and habitats into favorable conservation trends and no deterioration, for at least 30% here referred the trend to be positive. Of course, again, some of these habitats and species are related to forest ecosystems. On some other of the targets, these biodiverse landscape features, 10%, landscape features can also be trees, so there's here a link to it. And the final point here that I would refer is this planting 3 billion additional trees, respecting ecological principles, which is one of the ambitious targets you can find in the biodiversity strategy, to be further pursued in the upcoming forest strategy. On other elements, on this one, I will just refer probably the last one, in the sense that there's a full chapter on greening cities. And actually, we often forget the big potential that cities already have on nature. And when it comes to planting trees, well, urbanites like trees, and there you can have many win-wins. So there's another angle of bringing trees in this urban context. Other issues you can find there that will not develop much, but you do find there a proposal for a new governance of biodiversity, quite strong messages on financing this up to 20 billion a year to be unlocked by EU, national and private funds, engaging with business. And under the promotion of nature-based solutions, of course, there are many uses of forests and trees that can be duly labeled as nature-based solutions if they do benefit natural ecosystems. On the global component, I won't go in detail, other than saying you will find in the strategy what we propose as the goals, as the objectives the EU will seek to get in this global deal that is to be negotiated next year in China, in Kunming, under this COP15 of the Convention of Biological Diversity. And our strategy in terms of EU commitments aims at paving the way for EU leadership by example, as from the Green Deal and the political guidelines. So we do not aim to make the whole world need to follow our models, of course, but we do expect the whole world to approach on ambition all the main drivers of biodiversity loss that are now well known and ranked. Now, this seminar is also about the Green Deal overall. So I would say, remember you a bit more of what the Green Deal previously to the biodiversity strategy stated on forests. And to begin with, it did identify how much of resource extraction and processing of materials, fuels, and food is linked to greenhouse emissions and also to biodiversity loss. There's, as I said, this strong push to deal with biodiversity loss at the same rank of importance as climate change. It recognizes the pressure that forest ecosystems now suffer, notably as a result of climate change. And there's this message that EU forest areas need to improve in quality and quantity if we are to get to our climate and environmental goals. And there are some elements of the Green Deal that are indirectly related or potentially related to forests and the materials we get from forests, such as requirements for packaging to be reusable or regulatory framework for bio-based plastics and biodegradable plastics, the false green claims, green public procurement, secondary raw materials, and this renovation wave of public and private buildings. All of them, it's easy to perceive a potential link with forest, wood, and timber. Now, it also says that building on the biodiversity strategy, the Commission will prepare a new EU forest strategy, and it sets the objectives of such strategy for afforestation, forest preservation and restoration, and noticeably to help increase CO2 absorption, to reduce the extent of forest fires, so to raise prevention of forest fires, to promote the bioeconomy in respect of ecological principles, to incentivize forest managers to preserve and grow the forests through the CAP, and to promote the import of products that do not involve deforestation and forest degradation, which is an important trade-related element of the Green Deal. Now, within the biodiversity strategy, what you find there concretely is, again, repeating this need to increase quantity, quality, and resilience of our forests. The aim to put all forests in good health for their functions, biodiversity, climate, but further than that, of course, as providers of materials, products, and services under the circular bioeconomy. The forest strategies to come in 2021, building on the EU biodiversity strategy, and there's reference to the importance of the forest information system for Europe that was already launched, but will need to be further developed to serve as a real hub of information on European forests. Further than that, I've referred to this 3 billion additional trees that we planted up to 2030, with this reference to with a focus on urban, peri-urban, agroforestry also, to be promoted via the CAP, cohesion funds, the new European Urban Green Platform, the LIFE program, etc. And the Commission is to develop in parallel with the strategy guidelines for biodiversity-friendly afforestation and reforestation. In terms of forest management, there's this reference to increase the share of forest areas covered by management plans, both public and private, and to promote biodiversity-friendly practices, noticeably closer to nature forestry, for which we will also come in parallel with the forest strategy with guidelines on how to promote this approach. There's a specific chapter that deserves a mention. You will find a chapter on energy with a reference to bioenergy. The issue is to understand that, of course, renewable energy is fundamental, but we need it to be sustainable. So there's this need to be cautious on the uses and origins of bioenergy to ensure its sustainability. So basically the push is towards having for whole bioenergy the same trend as already in place for advanced biofuels, which is to base it in residues and non-reusable, non-recyclable waste. So in particular, there's this sentence on the use of old trees to be minimized for energy production. And there's this announcement that the assessment of the global biomass supply and demand to come by the end of this year and to be influential on the relevant legislation coming up as from the Green Deal. I think this was all. I hope I did not depass too much the time available, and I would now try to pass it over to you again, Georg. Thank you.
Thank you, Humberto. You did an excellent job in terms of timekeeping. Thanks for the interesting presentation. I have one announcement to make before we continue with our next keynote speakers. Up to now, all the participants, also there are many in this webinar, haven't been too active in terms of putting questions in the questions and answer file. So if you want to avoid the situation that we at EFI think about questions, you should become now active and put in your questions. Of course, only the really interesting one. And when you do it, please also say who you are, because we sometimes can read names there, but just put the sentence in, I'm representing the European Federation on someone, and I'm addressing this and this speaker. Just as an announcement, and I see already now there are new questions coming. Don't be shy, because in the end, we will directly after the speakers start with the question and answer session to not use too much of the spare time of all of you in our keynotes. That having been said, thanks a lot, Humberto. Please stay in the call for the questions and answers session. Our next distinguished speaker, I guess in Dublin, is Mr. Andrew Doyle. He is the Minister of State at the Department of Agriculture, Food and the Marine in Ireland. He is in this position since May 2016, and prior to that, he had several positions relating to agriculture in the Irish Parliament. He was inter alia the chairman of the Joint Committee. I'm not trying to read the Irish name because I will end up in a mistake. In the Irish, so he was in the Joint Committee on Agriculture, Food and the Marine, and also he has a farming background. And he has tried to brought in the practical experiences to the various roles he had held in the Irish policy-making system. And he has always highlighted the important role of indigenous agriculture, food, marine and forestry, and the horticultural industry for Ireland's economic recovery. Andrew lives also on a family farm with his wife Anne and 4 children. So definitely he is a well-qualified speaker. And we very much look forward, Andrew, to your keynote presentation. The floor is yours.
Thank you, George. You can hear me? Yes.
Yes.
Okay. Good afternoon. I'd like to thank the European Network Integrate for inviting me to discuss the important role forests play in the European Green Deal, and also to welcome the contribution by Humberto. I think he drew many comparisons with the importance of forestry with achieving the Global Development Goals and how integrated and important they are to each other. And as a minister with responsibility for forestry, and indeed, as you've said, as a farmer and a forest owner, I'm passionate about the ability and the importance of forestry into the future now more than ever, and the role that it can play, the pivotal role it can play. Next slide. Just before I get into the context, I wanted to give a brief overview of forestry in Ireland. So currently our forest cover is at 11%. At the beginning of the 20th century, in 1900, it was 1%. After many, many years and centuries indeed of deforestation, our target is to get to 18% during this century. It's very important in terms of the employment that it provides to in many rural areas, quite apart from its other environmental benefits. And you can see the sequestration is 3.8 megatons per annum in terms of the CO2 stored. We've had a significant afforestation program since about 1989, where we've seen 300,000 extra hectares planted. And the forest owners that you see there, 23,000, are basically private landowners like myself and others who've actually embraced and taken on growing trees on land. Up to 1989, almost all of the land was owned, forestry land was in the hands of the state-owned forestry company. It's currently at about 50%. So, and the future direction will be to see that number of forest owners increase, and current forest owners indeed probably plant more land. So if I move on to the next slide, the Green Deal, please. Yeah, so on the Green Deal itself is an exciting development, and it sets out an ambitious pathway to deliver cross-cutting measures to transform the EU into a fair, sustainable and prosperous society. And it's clear that forests are going to play a really important role in achieving that deal. And I think the member states themselves need to actively engage together in order to ensure its success. There's a number of high-level actions that forests can step up to meet those challenges, but we need these actions to be aligned, and I think that's critically important. The new EU forest strategy, biodiversity strategy, and circular economy plans will strengthen an integration of principles of sustainable forest management. The development of the bioeconomy is going to be essential if we are to increase the role of forests in decarbonising our economies. And the next Common Agricultural Policy strategic plan must ensure that forests continue to be a central role and complement agri-environment schemes that strengthen the competitiveness of the forest sector. So they need to be meshed together, the European Forest Strategy and the Common Agricultural Policy. I think that can't be overstated. Next slide, please. So the key forests are going to have to be resilient, and we need to manage and adapt the forests accordingly. Incidents and extremes of nature events will increase, creating many challenges in forests, I think. And although we in Ireland have not had the experience of the bark beetle yet, we are very aware of the impacts this is having on European forests, and we're also acutely aware that other threats aren't that far away. Forests are part of the solution and will play an important role in carbon sequestration, in storing carbon in harvested wood products, and in substituting fossil fuels and energy intensive materials that we've become familiar with and comfortable with. The bioeconomy, we need to ensure, plays an increasing role in the pathway to developing low carbon economies. Everything, almost everything anyway, that can be made from a fossil fuel can be made from wood. Next slide. On biodiversity, we need to continue to integrate biodiversity into sustainable forest management. And loss of biodiversity across all land uses will reduce our capacity to tackle climate change. And in supporting our landowners, we are supporting those who have managed our natural resources for generations. Delivering public goods and ecosystem services is about managing forests sustainably and planting the right tree in the right place and managing it properly. Increasing levels of sustainable harvesting will require foresters to take into account environmental sensitivities and to continue to integrate and implement good forest practice. So I think forest certification and other systems in place will actually ensure that that is what happens in the future. As for societal expectations, we need to improve on communication and ensure that the benefits of forestry and forests are more widely understood across communities. Integrating sustainable forest management needs to strike the right balance between the social, economic and environmental objectives of forest resources. A significant proportion of our forests are situated in dynamic landscapes, which supply a wide range of ecosystems and services. The primary function of some forests is to produce timber and a full range of harvested wood products that they provide will be essential if the expansion of the bioeconomy is to thrive. However, managing forests for timber production must also reflect the principles of sustainability and reflect on the important role they play in protecting the environment. And as we continue to make our existing plantation forests more resilient by increasing the range of species planted, we will ensure that existing areas of biodiversity are incorporated into the development of new forests that we create. And we must continue to support new forest owners and put in place measures that improves the facilities, knowledge transfer, creating a forest culture where both the landowners and the wider public appreciate the benefits and challenges of forest management. This will create the conditions for shared understanding and continuation of sustainable forest management. Society quite rightly makes demands on how forests should be managed, and it is important that we provide guidelines and direction to implement good forest practice. However, and crucially, we must continually work at balancing different expectations between that of the forest owner to manage their forests sustainably and to legitimate societal expectations. Not all forests are the same, and not all forests can provide the same benefits that society expects. However, we must ensure that forests rich in biodiversity are properly protected and safeguarded to ensure that they are conserved for the future. Next slide, please. COVID. I think one thing we've learned from COVID, the pandemic that has hit the globe, is that you can never be sure of what's around the corner. We should never count our chickens before they're hatched, and we should never put all our eggs into one basket. And I think it has undoubtedly had a significant impact on economies across Europe and beyond. It's caused significant disruption along supply chains from forests to sawmills to the markets that have been severely impacted, and demand has reduced significantly because of the EU-wide lockdowns, and it's only now beginning to increase as restrictions ease. But I do believe that the stimulus package, the EU stimulus package, provides significant funding and is a strong statement of intent for all businesses, and it's one that we should avail of in the forestry sector to allow members to access low-cost finance, which must be targeted to ensure that economies recover. Forest owners and the markets are resilient, and supply and demand for wood products will recover as economies rebuild. And one thing we've learned from COVID is the need for resilience. And something that's really in forest favour is trees and forestry, for whatever, don't have a short shelf life. They're not like fruit and vegetable. So if they're not needed today, they will be okay tomorrow or indeed next year. If a banana is ripe and it's not harvested and used, it becomes a biomass at best. So that's the difference, and I think it's important that we consider that, and that the global economies and global society will build on resilience more than anything else. Next slide, please. The Green Deal, the next steps. I think the first thing is we should embrace it and not see it as a threat. I think it sets an overarching target for member states in particular on their own forestry plans, their own biodiversity strategies, etc. But I think we need to integrate it. It's a signal, it's a brand that we can actually tap into, and we should actually embrace it. So the question on the subject matter of the webinar is what's in it for us. I think there's a lot in it for us. So we need to listen and continue to listen to the experiences and knowledge of foresters and landowners, and learn from those past experiences down the years. We need to ensure that the financial supports in the next CAP, as I said earlier, recognise the important contribution of forests in delivering on the ambition that's contained in the Green Deal. Forests, the forest industry, and the growing of the bioeconomy will provide wide-ranging employment opportunities as forest industries develop and recover, and new markets, and I've no doubt new markets, new innovation will create new markets as they develop as well. Next slide. I think I'm nearly there. Yes, the Green Deal is indeed ambitious. It's challenging, it does change the direction of travel, but more importantly, it sets us on a sustainable course towards carbon neutrality. It is completely complementary to the targets and ambitions set out in the Global Development Goals Agenda 2030. I think that's important, that we don't lose sight of that. So I think we need to embrace it across all member states. We need to align ourselves with it, align ourselves with each other, and work together. But we have a good story to tell. In Ireland, where we've 11% forest cover, we see forestry nationally, and it's in our new programme for government, hopefully, that we would ramp up our targets as bringing us a long way towards our meeting our climate change obligations. In other parts of Europe, where you have a far higher percentage of cover, it's still really important in terms of further developing the bioeconomy where other resources may not be as plentiful. So I think there's something in it. It's different in every state, but there's something common, a huge amount of commonality between member states that we should embrace. Okay, hope that's okay. Thank you. I hope I didn't go over time.
Thank you, Andrew. That was an excellent presentation, and you both did a great job in keeping the time. I have to say that also now, meanwhile, our participants are doing an excellent job in putting interesting questions, and we are trying to sort them a bit. And we will proceed as follows, that I will now read 3 questions to you, and then I will give the floor. I would suggest perhaps first to Humberto, as he had a bit more time to recover, and then to you, Andrew. And my first question that I would like to put is from Anna Holmgren. She's addressing Humberto. How does he interpret that the revised forestry strategy is to be built on a biodiversity strategy? How does he see the interactions between the 2 strategies? The second question is addressing both speakers. It is from Andre Pinto from Portugal. So I was assuming it might address more Humberto, but he wants to address both. In the Mediterranean forests, forest fires are a key part to the ecosystem renewal. Is there any proposal to help countries such as Portugal, Spain, and Greece to cope with fires so that its natural fires don't escalate? And then I have a third question that I would like to put, and this is specifically addressing Andrew. The Green Deal, and it's from Andre Pinto again. The Green Deal is an exciting development and will go according to plan if the states works well. My question is if there are any plans also addressing the people. So perhaps it's also a question for both, so that they do not, once again, that they are reminded of the importance of forest along with agriculture and biodiversity. So it's basically addressing in your policies, how do you involve people? Humberto, are you ready to take the first swift?
Thanks for the questions, everyone, and let me address the 3, if I may. First, the first question is very welcome. How do I see the forest strategy building on the biodiversity strategy? Actually, I was surprised to see some reactions as if biodiversity being taken more into account on forests looking like a threat to the forest sector or some sort of going into silos or not addressing it holistic. It's rather on the contrary. What the Green Deal is saying, and also the biodiversity strategy, is that the biodiversity component of forests is to be taken into account with all the others, of course. So you can rest assured that the forest strategy will build on the biodiversity strategy, meaning it will be fully compatible with it. It will develop further elements that need to be developed, such as the context for the 3 billion planting. And we can only read from that sustainable forest management will surely be taken into account. And indeed, the overall holistic, multifunctional approach of forests will be covered in the upcoming forest strategy. Now, I need to thank Andrea for the question on forest fires, because indeed, I'm also from Portugal, a country that has seen its own mega fires in 2017. And I can tell you the following. The support to Southern Europe is what the biodiversity strategy is proposing. I can tell you, I've seen with my own eyes what are unsustainable and unhealthy forests in Portugal. We know the mega fires come from climate change. They are fueled by climate change, but they are also fueled by improperly managed forests, forests that are not in the right place, and forests that contradict the ecological conditions of some areas. So I'm convinced that more and more the nature conservation and nature restoration agenda and the forest fire prevention agenda coincide. So if we go for appropriate ecosystem restoration, we will have the resilience that will help prevent forest fires. And I'll tell you, the mega fires we have seen are not amenable through suppression, through combat the fire. We need the prevention. That's the only way to go. Now, would the Green Deal also address the people? Well, it does. You know, the Green Deal is not an environmental and climate agenda only. It is expressly first an economic agenda, a bet on the the ambition on climate and environment to steer the economy into one of the ways, but to do it under a just transition that leaves no one behind. And that's the key word. It's not a change where there will be some losers that we just forget. It has the instruments, including the financial instruments, to bring further support where more support is needed so that no one is left behind. So indeed, in my view, it's also a social agenda. Then these are my replies. Back to you, John.
Thank you, Humberto. Then I would like to address Andrew. Specifically, do you still know the questions, Andrew? I think especially the third question was addressing you, again, about how to involve people in the policy-making process. Andrew, I think you are muted. Can you unmute yourself?
Sorry.
Okay.
With regard to the first question Andre asked about the fires, I think the key thing there is right tree in the right place, properly managed. That is really important. As Humberto has said, if you don't do that, you leave the forest in question wherever open to. It's not you're not preventing. In other words, you're actually leaving yourself wide open to susceptibility of fire, and trying to contain and control it when it happens is far more difficult than trying to prevent it in the first place. So I think the right tree in the right place, properly managed is really important. With regard to the second question, if the Green Deal does include people, it includes economies. It's all about communication. So whether you start with schools, and I think in Finland, EFI are very much linked with the like of Luke, is it Luke, L-U-K-E? The sort of Luke.
I think.
Yes.
I'm not a Finn. So.
And yes, they actually have a really good program that goes around to schools and children, informing them, and it's much more part of the culture, as I mentioned earlier. I think moving our society into an economy based on the bioeconomy and reducing the resilience on fossil fuels, fossil-based materials, high-energy materials is really important. And initiatives such as forest certification, stronger regard for the environment as planting and replanting and new afforestation programs take place, and opening up as much as possible, as many woods and timber woodlands as possible to the public so that they can enjoy it themselves, I think is going to be really important, because this is a message where we're trying to bring everybody along. Humberto said leave nobody behind, but bring everybody along is the same thing, both from the point of view of job creation, job opportunity, but also in terms of what society will benefit out of, what will be the benefit to society out of embracing the Green Deal.
Thank you very much, Andrew. So I would like to continue with 3 more questions by the participants. And my first question is has been asked by Erwin Dreyer from INRAE in France. And he is asking forest expansion, and he's, I think, addressing both of you. Forest expansion is going on in Europe, even without planting. I think he's referring also to natural forest regrowth in several European countries. Will planting be concentrated then on urban and peri-urban and agricultural areas? And how will this planting effort take the impact of climate change into account? The second question has been asked by Viorel Pluider. I hope that this is correctly pronounced. And he's addressing, he's specifically addressing Humberto, but also Andrew from his country perspective. So you're not supposed to answer for Europe, Andrew. The storage of carbon in harvested wood products from forest looks as a more promising solution on short term than enhancing carbon in standing forest. For instance, it contributes to higher emission reduction targets until 2030. So will the forestry strategy promote more greenhouse gas mitigation actions through more carbon in wood products? So it's basically asking what is the right climate mitigation strategy for carbon in the stands, carbon in the forest harvested wood products. Oh, and then there's the next question asked actually by EFI's director. Hello, Mark. Nice that you are in this. The impact of climate change and natural disturbances, as Minister Doyle remarks, would it not be more sensible to have an adaptation plan for European forests that includes tree planting where necessary, but also tree cutting to promote new species and genotypes instead of only focusing on tree planting. So adaptation measures could benefit biodiversity and should be biodiversity based to enhance forest resilience. Yep. I think it's a question to both of you. Are you well prepared? Then I would hand over. I think again, Andrew, it seems you are really now warming up. I would suggest, because you just answered the last round, so we start again with Humberto, but next time we change and we will start with you, Andrew.
Okay. So you're starting with me now, okay.
Well, yeah. Actually okay. I thought, okay, if you want to.
So. Oh, no, go ahead, let Humberto go, sorry, yeah.
Oh, should I pick it? Okay, let me try to be quick.
Next time you, Andrew, I promise.
Yeah, sure.
Thanks for the questions. Yes, indeed, there's of course forest expansion even without planting, but that does not mean that we cannot give a hand, especially in the right places with the right species. I think it was Andrew saying the right tree in the right place. So that's exactly what it signals, that we want more tree cover. But in relation to the impact of climate change, well, it also says we must do it while at the same time improving resilience. So the challenge is to put more trees in a way that we will be at the same time making the forests more resilient to forest fires. So that's the challenge, picking the right place, the right species. We know there are not trees that can't burn, but some trees properly managed can certainly, and I've seen that in practice, be more resilient to climate change and forest wildfires rather than others. The issue of enhancing carbon, well, we want both. Yes, of course, we will promote carbon and wood products, but that does not mean at all that keeping carbon in standing forests is not a good approach. It's an excellent approach, actually, and science is evolving. Even major forests keep absorbing, and very especially if we take into account the carbon in the soil, sometimes the balance is quite striking. So we aim at both several avenues for mitigating climate change. And to Mark, thanks for the question. Well, indeed, you're very right. Adaptation is very important, but it does not mean it's better than planting. We have one, and we will have a revised EU adaptation strategy. For sure, forests are also covered. We have these target to plant 3 billion trees, and we will have the forest strategy building on the biodiversity strategy to conduct that effort. So I'm convinced, in line with the reply I've given before, that this enhanced planting can come together with a well-planned resilience to climate change, which is the same thing as adaptation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Humberto. Andrew, the floor is yours.
Yeah, just need to unmute. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Oh, you can?
Well.
Oh, sorry,
yes.
I didn't have to unmute. Yeah, just on forest expansion, and specifically with regard to the urban sort of forestry expansion, I think it's part and parcel of it. We have a couple of schemes. One is called the neighborhood scheme. So local, small and not so small community public open area spaces can be turned into neighborhoods where people have access to it. There's part of the thing is education for people as they walk through a wood. So quite near where I live, for instance, we have on where a water reservoir is, a big reservoir for the city water supply, and incorporated into it is a woodland that was there anyway, and it's been enhanced into a neighborhood, and it's got so successful we need to build a new car park for people to walk. So that's really good. With regard to the carbon, I think I'd make the point that it's a happy mixture we need to get, not rather one versus the other. And it sort of goes to Mark's question about improving existing woodlands, better management. So I know he's very familiar, and many people are, with continuous cover forestry. But like, we have another scheme called the Woodland Improvement Scheme. So people are actually encouraged to go in and maybe do selective thinning in woods that maybe weren't as well managed. And what you're doing there is you're improving the woodland itself, the economic potential of it, but also improving the biodiversity and indeed the carbon storage. But as we move towards a bioeconomy, I think it's really important that we look at the value the harvested wood product, whether it's in its core product, which is structural or furniture making or whatever, for locking in carbon, but also in other uses right across many different industries indeed, be it textiles, be it cosmetics, be it biomass, energy. We're displacing a non-renewable fossil-based product in many cases. So if we factor in what we're displacing in terms of carbon benefit, I think you get a better handle on what's actually happening here. But the wood itself, the timber itself in the wood, is actually storing and sequestering carbon. I think I put up the figure of what our woodland is doing in Ireland at 3.8 million tonnes per hectare per year. It's really important that isn't lost sight of in terms of what else is being the ambition wants to do as well. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Andrew. I will read the next 3 questions. And this time I will ask you, Andrew, to first respond to the questions. So the first question is by Lars Lestadius, and he is asking, what will be the legal status of the EU forest strategy, and how is it expected? How will it influence? How important will it be? And he says he is a policy researcher. So perhaps this is addressing the both of you. How would you wish and how would you think it will look like? Then I have a question by Diarmuid McAree to Humberto. Why do you only reduce the use of hazardous pesticides by 50% in the Green Deal proposals? Why not 100%? I'm not sure in how far this is addressing forestry, but it might be addressing. And then I have a question by Maximilian Haug from FECOF. And he points out that against the background of the enormous challenge of climate change, how can forest owners in Europe be enabled to implement necessary adaptation measures? And he highlights that after COVID and the enormous damage to forests in recent years, they also need an economic perspective. And he thinks that the Green Deal, there's a risk that he misses ambitious goals in relation to forestry if this economic function is not taken sufficiently into account. And he's also thanking the both of you for great presentations. Andrew, do you want to go first?
Legal status.
What would you wish for from an Irish perspective?
Well, I think anything that has, you set out a strategy. So it's an EU-wide strategy that needs to be embraced. Whether it legally is completely binding or not, I'm not sure. But I think the first thing that it needs to do is take into account the subsidiarity, the member states' own competence in terms of how they achieve the strategy itself. So under the Common Agricultural Policy, new Common Agricultural Policy that will be in place, whatever year, 21, 22 now, subsidiarity is important. So you have targets to get to, but you're not mandated. Each state is not mandated as to how they get to the target. I think in terms of adaptation, I'm trying to mix both questions that have been directed at me. I think if there's a recognition of what can be achieved, be it through the biodiversity and plan and forestry decarbonising, if landowners, and in particular if you look at what the figures I put up there with regard to the Irish profile now, which is 23,000 private landowners, many of them are since the early 90s indeed. If they are to be encouraged and more to be encouraged to actually embrace forestry, it needs to be recognised as a public good. It can be paid for out of Common Agricultural Policy Environment funds, but I also think it needs to be acknowledged and rewarded out of the likes of a carbon fund. In other words, if you're actually offsetting carbon and you're doing something towards that, you're committing land to that effort, it should be rewarded, quite simply. And it's as much a recognition as much as a monetary reward, but both are very important. So landowners are then helped in their way to adapt their land. And in Ireland, we see it, certainly I see it, as being something that doesn't need to be in competition with, more in harmony with what we do mainstream here, which is food production, milk, dairy products, beef, dry stock, you know, beef and lamb. So it should be seen as complementary to rather than in competition with. And if we embrace that principle, I think we can actually go a long way towards meeting our climate change mitigation through an afforestation program, be it a broadleaf strip margin against watercourses to prevent nutrient runoff, or be it, you know, a bigger commercial plantation. There's land there for everything, and it's the right tree in the right place motto all the way through here. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Andrew. And you put some interesting points now also for Humberto to take the second swing. Humberto, you still recall the questions?
Yes, I recall.
Thank
first,
you.
Well, legal status of the forest strategy, how influential it will be. Well, as much as a strategy is like the biodiversity strategy. Strategies are strategies. They are not legal instruments. Their influence depends first of political endorsements, which means in the case of the EU, what will the Parliament and the Council, the European Council, conclude about the strategies. Also, they depend, of course, of public opinion. Indeed, I think the Green Deal was pretty much a reply to public opinion. But if these goals are endorsed, the forest strategy can be as influential as its contents and its buy-in by the sector, by member states, by authorities, and so forth. On the pesticides, why only 50% of the hazardous ones? Well, we actually often get the same question reversed, which is, how can you be so ambitious? Because indeed what the both biodiversity strategy and the farm to fork strategy approved at the same time, they say we will reduce 50% of use and risk of pesticides, but specifically of the most hazardous ones, we will reduce 50% use, which is already a lot. We must understand within the hazardous, some are very needed and they are less hazardous if properly applied. So this is a trend to push towards those that have less damage, and also to those solutions that do exist, which use other than chemical inputs to address pests, as some agroecological approaches do. So I hope we get this, and then we will deal with the rest of the hazardous ones. Now the question is, how can forest owners cope with adaptation in this harsh economic context? Well, I would say, how can't they? How can we just forget about adaptation? Because indeed, all these threats we are seeing, the droughts, the pests, the forest fires, they have a climate component. They will come more often. So if we do nothing, by we, I mean including forest owners, we risk losing many of our forests. So for sure, we need to rebuild the forests in a more resilient way, probably in a more natural way to a certain extent, and for that we need support. And here I would say, adding to carbon funds, there's a big instrument that can, in my view, be better used for forests, which is the Common Agriculture Policy. If the level of ambition is retained and the instruments that are proposed for the new CAP, I'm having in mind, for instance, the eco schemes, they can be easily diverted to forest measures or to agroforestry, which is a very promising way of maybe still using the forests, but in a way which is which also produce other crops. I think there's a lot of avenue on this. It's a big challenge, I know, but we must face it.
Thanks a lot, Humberto, and for also bringing the CAP into our discussion. Now I see that the Integrate network is waking up, so we get some questions now on integrated forest management. My first question is put by a colleague of mine, Markus Lindner from FE, mostly to Humberto, but I think also addressing Andrew. And I would suggest that we this time again start with Humberto, and then we change it also for the remaining 1 or 2 question rounds. Markus is asking, as this is a seminar of the Integrate network, I would be welcome to hear a view on the role of integrated forest management that integrate wood production and biodiversity protection. And he also thinks that the Green Deal and biodiversity seems to focus more on set-aside measures and expanding protected areas. So this is a question mostly to Humberto, but I think also Andrew might have an informed answer on that. And then there was a question that has disappeared now from my menu, but I found it very interesting. So I will try it. I forgot the name of the person that asked, but it was someone from an African country asking, So what is in the Green Deal, also relating, I think, to forest in terms of international collaboration? And I guess it's mostly to Humberto. And sorry, it's not any more specifically in my menu. And then there's a question from Thomas Hausmann from German BML. And he is asking mostly again, Humberto, what role do you think, Humberto, can the integrate network play? So in which context we are organizing the seminar to implement both, I guess, new EU strategies, biodiversity and forestry strategy. So,
should I start?
Yes, sorry, I forgot whom I asked. Yes, Humberto, you start next. It's again Andrew.
Well, thanks very much for the questions. They allow me to share some thoughts that I really would like to share in this context. And one is this issue of integrated forest management versus set aside. I first have, well, let's say, one conceptual comment to do. I often see this divide as if, you know, either you manage or you set aside. Well, I happen to not agree on this divide. I think that we have all the options in the way we use the land. We can have a very interventive, intense management in some cases, like what would be a pure monoculture industrial plantation, let's say, while at the other angle, we can have an old growth forest where our management option is to allow ecological processes to be left essentially undisturbed. And for me, this is a pure integrated management approach also, where you need to decide what level of visitation can you have. Do you have invasive alien species to manage? Is there any threat that you must control to allow the ecological processes to remain undisturbed? So I don't really have my mind focused on the divide. But I understand for some minds is as if we set aside, we kind of lose value, while for others, if you manage, we kind of lose value. I think we have a value management and nature we can have in different doses everywhere. But also, I don't think at all that the biodiversity strategy is focusing on set aside. First, when we say 30% protected areas on land and on sea, I remind you, there's a lot of forests currently in protected areas. They are managed, they are used, they are sustainably managed. So let's not equate at all protection with non-management or non-forestry. We need foresters in protected areas. But now within this 30%, we want that 1/3 to be strictly protected, including old growth forests and primary forests in the EU, which we suppose it's around 1 to 1.5% of EU forests. So we are very far to putting all the eggs on strict protection or on set aside, I would say. And this allows me to go to question number 3, the role of the integrated network. I really and honestly, not to give you warm feelings, I do think you can help a lot. First, on pushing this idea that when we take more into account nature, closer to nature forestry, sustainable forest management with more biodiversity friendly approaches, we are integrating. So it's very much, as I see, your role of putting together different schools of thought, different approaches to nature and forests. And then we are coming with guidelines on biodiversity-friendly afforestation, reforestation, closer to nature forestry. Some of you will be involved actually in the working group on natures and forests, where we will develop this with the willing. So again, if you can steer your knowledge capacity from this diverse network to constructively build more an harmonious approach and a non-silo approach on forests, that's very welcome. The question on the international cooperation versus forest. Well, to begin with, the whole EU biodiversity strategy is also set as a way to help lead by example and to influence thus the international process that should lead us to a new deal for biodiversity until 2030. So that's one of the elements on putting this focus on some ambitious restoration, protection, and so forth. We aim this to be picked up and followed by others. But adding to this, both the Green Deal, the biodiversity strategy, and also the Farm to Fork strategy, they do say that we aim to ensure that our consumption in the EU is not promoting deforestation, forest degradation, and I would say probably ecosystem degradation in general elsewhere. So also from this adaptation of trade policy and to a wider sustainable EU that does not export its unduly its footprint, is, again, I think influential. We are still a big market.
Thanks a lot, Humberto. Andrew, what is your perspective?
Now I'm back again, sorry. Just, I'd agree very much with Humberto. I think it's all about balance. It's integrating biodiversity, the economy and silviculture. If you take our standard, we've a number of grant and premium category programs in our afforestation program. If you take the standard one, which is mainly conifer, spruce, 15% of that area will be broadleaves and 15% will be area biodiversity. There's nothing that prevents, say, and going back to the integration and meshing with CAP, there's nothing to stop that 15% biodiverse area, for instance, being an area where you could improve the environment to develop the pollinator plan or some other second measure which could be funded out of the CAP as well. And I agree entirely with the concept of agroforestry as a method to get us to increase our area. So I think it's really important, going back to Mark's question earlier, that if woodlands are not doing as well as they could do from the point of view of the biodiversity and the economic value and the climate carbon sequestration effort, then you go in and you help, you try and make that better by actions that you take in terms of tinning and whatever. With regard to the question about more globally, I think there's the Great Green Wall, initiative, which is an 8 billion fund, which I think the EU actually contribute, which is to create a necklace of villages in Africa to build better economies, to allow people to stay and work in the areas to stop stem migration. So I think we need to look at that role, and that's much bigger than us. It's UN, but I think it's really something that the EU, as part of our policy and our forestry and the Green Deal, indeed, could set an example for. So I don't think we should just limit ourselves to what we want to do in Europe. And I would say we also, in Ireland, have developed a native woodland program. We have a woodland environment fund, so multinationals and corporations can actually pay a landowner to put some of their land into a native woodland, native Irish woodland, and that indeed is used then as part of Woodlands for Water initiative, which is actually to improve and protect water quality. So you integrate land use policy that isn't just in silos. I think that's really the important message I'm trying to get across, maybe a little bit jumbled, but that's what I'm trying to say here.
Thanks a lot, Andrew. I take a last round of questions and I try to make it very brief, that you also have time to answer, and then we come to a closing round. So I have a question here from Natalie Hufnagel. How will you ensure that the implementation of the biodiversity strategy is carried out in a partnership approach with forest owners and managers? This mostly goes to Humberto. And then there's two questions by Dennis Popov, representing Mondo. He's asking first about the ambition to increase the share of protected areas to 30%. How does it fit with the approach of ensuring biodiversity and carbon in integrated forestry, facing the demand of growing bioeconomy? And then he also asks, are there already compensation mechanism and budget secured for landowners who have to take out, which forest is becoming strictly protected? And then last question, there's a question by, and now it has disappeared, by a colleague from Finland asking about the genetic diversity aspect and if it has not been a bit forgotten in the EU biodiversity strategy, I assume. So I think this last, so Humberto, you are more on the target of the questions, but I think for some, I'm sure that also Andrew has a few. Andrew, do you want to give it a start?
Yeah, yes. Let me see. If I go to the protected areas question in particular,
yes.
we have, under the Common Agricultural Policy, under the Rural Development Programme, a number of initiatives, and in Ireland, farmers and landowners get paid for areas of natural constraint. In other words, they're compensated for what they can't produce. Those same areas in general, and I generalize a little bit, are areas that would be otherwise known as areas of natural rich in biodiversity, you know, for high nature farming. So instead of compensating people for what they're not doing, they should be rewarded for what they are doing. In other words, they are providing a better, a more carbon friendly, a more climate friendly land use that doesn't maybe produce food as mainstream as some of the more intense areas. So we're rewarding rather than compensating. And I think in protected areas, if people are in woodlands in particular, if their forests are to become more of a protected area, people should be rewarded for what they're doing. And that's why I mentioned earlier about tapping into the carbon fund as well, because symbolically it's very important that it's recognized that it's doing something to offset carbon emissions. So I think it's really important that that signal is sent. On the genetic testing, I think, like anything else, we should always embrace the most recent and most modern science. Like, we should never lose the fact that knowledge transfer and research are really important, you know, that we actually, so with tree improvement programs and breeding resilience and adaptation are going to be really important. So I think it's not that anything should be left behind in terms of what we're trying to do. This is a holistic approach, and it is all the way through. And I'd say this one more time, then I won't say it again. It's important that land use, the Common Agricultural Policy, and the Green Deal are harmonized, that they are integrated, because we have to not only get society to accept it, but landowners right across Europe, and there are many, many millions of them, will actually have to buy into this deal as well. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Andrew. And there's a bit of a question also in the last statement by the Irish minister to you, Humberto. But Humberto, the floor is yours.
Okay, taking the questions I picked, the first one from Natalie that I thank. Well, let me start by a side comment. I very well understand that we cannot do nature conservation or restore biodiversity without taking into account those that own the land and live from the land, landowners, forest owners. That's absolutely fundamental. And I also understand that for many of them in the past, conservation meant restriction, sometimes with no consultation, sometimes with no rationale, and there's quite a hard feelings that can still be found very often in Europe around this. So with this said, we now have a new angle on conservation and biodiversity, which is, of course, protection means some restriction. Of course, this element does not just fade away, but now the new keyword of solutions that can come from restoration, where you sometimes have a pest, a fire, a drought, or a forest or a land that's not really as productive as it should be before, then nature can bring in solutions, and this is the approach I like. But to be honest, to have this approach, well, we can only dance tango when we have two. We need to do it with the willing. And I've also seen some reactions of those that have seen what a biodiversity strategy now disposing on forests. This is a threat we are against. Well, if you just start by I'm against, it's very difficult to engage. I trust that will not be what will happen. And indeed, in this working group we have established on forests and nature, it's precisely to also bring all the stakeholders, including those that own land, but also to bring in together the nature administrations and the forest administrations that do not necessarily often engage or discuss together. And further than this, there will be not only the public consultations, for instance, of the forest strategy, but many chances to engage with stakeholders that we will cherish, at least from our side, the environment, we can ensure you about that. Now, another question on this, how these 30% protected areas linked to integrated forest management? Well, precisely, that's what I said. I think protected areas should be excellent examples of integrated protected management. I don't see a divide. I'm not setting aside 30% of land to keep forestry out. On the contrary, we want just to have in this 30% quite sustainable and biodiversity friendly approaches to biodiversity, which in my view is purely management and integrated forest management. The issue of budget for landowners for strict protection. First, beware. We are not saying that we are going to put strict protection everywhere. As I said, this 10% strict protection in what amounts to forests is a small amount of the old growth and primary forests. They are unevenly distributed in Europe, that's true, but still to be seen first is, are these forests private or are they public? And second, if they are private and they are old growth forests, very likely that's also because the owner likes to have the old growth forests. So of course, the budget that's needed for biodiversity, as this 20 billion a year, does encompass as adequate potential compensation, but it's not pre-established in a specific budget. Now, finally, on genetic diversity forgotten, I've heard this before, that the biodiversity strategy does not have the word genetics often enough. It's there anyway, referring to traditional varieties in what comes to agro-biodiversity, and also on the access and benefit sharing of genetic resources. But I would put it this way. Biodiversity is diversity of genes, populations, species, ecosystems. We also don't find their population diversity. It's encompassed in biodiversity. So when we refer to ecological principles, I would say that encompasses genetical principles also. The proper ecological principles must take into account the need to protect and take into account genetic diversity. So no intention whatsoever to forget about genetic diversity. Over to you, Jörg.
Thank you, Humberto. Well, Andrew, Humberto, already now, I have to say you did an excellent job, also addressing all the complexity of questions. Now you will get a very easy last question, which is basically what is, in 30 seconds, from against the background of the seminar and your experience, the best way to implement the Green Deal in Europe's forest in the future. But to make your life a bit easier, we will first ask the participants. We give them 4 options. You will see the outcome of the poll, and then you can formulate either a 5th option, you're free to do this, or you just follow one of the 4 a bit provocative statements. So just relax, prepare for your 30-second statement on the question. And now everyone else should not relax, please engage. We will open the poll now. And we have, so again, the question, what is the best way to implement the Green Deal in Europe's forests in the future? Focusing on the sustainable production of wood, a critical renewable resource for the bioeconomy, focusing on biodiversity and nature conservation, as forests are Europe's biggest remaining natural space, integrating biodiversity conservation and wood production in Europe's managed forest, and separating land between intensively managed and strictly protected areas. Unfortunately, all our participants, they have not the possibility to be nuanced and develop their 5th option, so you have to make your choice. And I guess we have 30 seconds for that. Is this true, Jose? Okay, so just make your choice. We give you 20 more seconds. Oh, I cannot vote. 5 more seconds. Okay, let's see what the results are. Okay, so I can just promise you we didn't pay the participants for the responses. Now I would like to hand it over to you, Andrew and Humberto, and I guess perhaps Humberto, you want to give it a start? Do you either also want to make a choice or formulate your own response to this question?
Let me tell you, there's only one that I definitely would not pick, which is number 4, because I don't believe at all in separating somewhere the intensive managed and all the rest is for protection. On the contrary, I'm pretty much an integrationist, as you have understood. They can have several layers or elements or intensities of management in several approaches, but that one I really would not pick. In relation to the 3 others, I would focus on the 3. It's the sustainable production of wood, it's the biodiversity in nature, and it's the integration to properly manage European forests. I think my best sentence is actually, I'll pick it from Andrew. as you said, that you need to embrace the Green Deal, make it your own. It's not a threat. It is fully compatible with sustainable forest management and the values you cherish. Yes, the balance must be shaken up a little bit and there, but that's the future. Make it your own. Thank you.
Thank you. That was a perfect closing statement already. Humberto, Andrew, what would you choose? Or would you also formulate an own sentence?
Yep, I'm
Andrew?
back. Yes, sorry. Yes, well, I think by virtue of the fact that integrating is the first word in number 3, I would absolutely agree that number 3 is of the 4 is by far the highest priority, and in the order that they've actually been chosen. I do not believe in separation like Humberto. I think embrace the Green Deal, get involved in forming the strategy, be ambitious and bring the people with you is really the important components of having a successful outcome to this. And integrating the Green Deal with the global development goals and indeed in ensuring that the common agricultural policy is compatible with it are going to be the key components to success here. And I wish everybody well in it. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Andrew. And I suggest that you and Humberto have a follow-up on the agricultural policy after that.
Absolutely.
Thank you very much. Embracing the Green Deal. That is a bit the joint denominator for our 2 keynote speakers. I would really like to thank you. I think you did an excellent job in helping all the participants to embrace the Green Deal and to engage in the discussion on how to find the balance and how to integrate the different aspects of our forests for society. I would also really like to thank the participants. We still have more than 100, which is a good sign. So you did a great job, keynote speakers. So they're still online. And I hope that no one is angry now with us for not selecting the questions you have been putting. I would also like to thank the Integrate Network for coming up with this idea, for supporting us. And I mean, we heard some good things on the role of Integrate. And also, I think what we heard from the keynote speakers in the end, I see it as a bit as a mandate for a network to continue bringing people and perspectives together in policy making, but also in science and forest and conservation management practice. Yeah, and I also would like to thank EFI's team for having done a great job. It was a great webinar from my perspective. Usually we would end up now with a bottle of wine. Unfortunately, we cannot do it this time. But I really would like to thank once again you, Humberto and Andrew, for taking the time, for being available, for answering to all the questions. You did an excellent job. And I hope you will join us for another webinar. I think it will not be the last one we are going to do in the Integrate Network. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thanks to all.
Bye. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.